Hi there, welcome to another one of the videos in the Project-Based Learning Training Series. My name is R.Whitehead. I'm a faculty fellow for High Impact Practices at Iowa State University's Center for Excellence in Learning and Teaching, or CELT. I'm also an associate professor of architecture in the Department of Architecture at Iowa State. Today's session is going to actually talk about the next phase of project-based learning, where we get into the ideas of ideation and design. And we're going to talk a little bit, of course, about how you set it up, tactics for how you do it, and larger considerations. In this phase of the workshop, we're going to talk about the design and ideation aspects of the project, talking about how we can actually nurture the creative aspects of the project-based learning experience. So we're moving further and further into the project-based learning process. We've gone from the discovery and ideation phase into some areas that for some people are a bit uncomfortable, this idea of what is design and what is ideation. So in efforts to make this more comfortable, we'll talk about this process, how this process is connected to the rest of the project-based learning, scaffolding, and ways that we can continue with some sort of feedback or actual tactics that'll help you in this work. This slide is always important to me because it's these thoughts about trusting the creative process and doing one's best and nurturing the work are good reminders, not only to you, but also to your students, that there's something about if we do in fact trust that being creative will help, and if our efforts are in fact valued, and that the work itself is worthy of being nurtured. And the reason I think it's important to say this not only to instructors, but to students as well, is because curiosity and creativity is something that has to be nurtured. It is not like a direct sort of right or wrong question. This has to be something that can get uncomfortable because we're searching for answers that aren't easily accessible. The other important part about this is about trusting the process and doing one's best, is that I don't accept the idea that somehow creativity is something that's only born. Everyone knows it's a practice. Like any creative act, it's a practice that's filled with skills and knowledge. It can certainly be taught, and it can certainly be learned. There may be a level of uncomfortability in doing so, but these are essential sort of teaching ideas that we can creatively solve problems no matter what the field is. Just because it says design or ideation, it doesn't mean that it's any less valid for something that's, say, a STEM field. Creativity and creative problem solving is essential for all of the work that we do. Let's resituate the role for design and ideation within the larger project-based learning model. And at this point within a project-based learning process, we've already gone through a discovery, research, or empathy phase. We've then taken that research and we've tried to interpret it. So in doing so, the participants that you have ideally been through a full cycle of both Kolb and Bloom. If we look at those activities and the activities, they've gone from remembering to evaluating, to creating, and to evaluate, to create. In that, we've already established our problem or question, we've developed our inquiry, we've encouraged the student voice and choice. We're now at the stage of reflection. Well, what does it mean? What does our discovery mean for reflection? How can we critique it and revise it so that we make our way through again from a design process? Important part here is that we know that there are certain artifacts and evidence that have been produced as part of this process. So we say, okay, now what? Now that we've done the background research, what do we do next? So situating that within this particular diagram of a project-based learning process, these are things we often come back to within this workshop. We've talked about how there's a larger course design idea of the project, learning goals and who one's teaching with, and the schedule and the scaffolding that the semester has already began, the discovery process of research that takes this sort of guiding question and they find things out. There's a module. You interpret the data from the research and it's brought down and it's narrowed down to the end of another module. And so here we are in ideation. We take what we've learned from discovery and interpretation towards ideation as we go forward. This is a critical stage where some people have done research work and developed empathy, and they're not sure how to connect these things logically in terms of what the next steps are. Sometimes the discovery and interpretation phases can be seen as an analytical, just a purely analytical task, even though it's clearly creative as well. So now when they get to this point where they see the idea of design, they think that somehow it's a totally different thing because it's creative or designy. It really is just about problem solving. It's about assembling and sort of developing their work in a particular way. But instead of seeing that as just an extension of work that's already been done, some people freeze. In fact, some instructors do that as well. It's important to not let that happen. Tether this thing back to the work that's been done before. The reason I think that diagrams are important like this is because it shows that ideation and design is not on its own as an island. In fact, it's related not only to what's happened before, what's the purpose of the class, what have we learned, but also where it's going. What artifact do we want to have? What evidence are we going to have? In fact, how are we going to test and evaluate this soon? So when we ask the question, now what? Think about what you are making or ideating or designing and why. It isn't random. It isn't out of context. It's fully embedded within a context, and it has a particular purpose. When you're asking and developing your course about what should be made and why, sometimes we need to even back up further. Think about the role of your course within a project-based learning curriculum. We know that these skills can be built across a curriculum and not just in one class. So whether your class is an introductory class in which exposure is important, of course these are usually beginning level students with a limited amount of time, or a capacity building for intermediate students. In capacity building, they've had some exposure to the project-based learning process. They understand about design and ideation. They're given a little bit more responsibility. They've asked to do more deliverables. Or are you talking now about a phase 3 in which responsibility is what is intended to have the students demonstrate? Usually these be advanced students with some sort of skill mastery. They have a project that's developed, capstone courses, long time span. In that, look at them again. Exposure, capacity building, responsibility. What you are making, what you're ideating for exposure is quite different than capacity building or even responsibility. So when you're going through and you're trying to decide what is it that's next, how do we ideate these, make sure that you then go back to the larger perspective of learning objectives through your curriculum. You want to anchor this next step of design. And the 20-80 rule essentially says that the first 20% of any sort of project that you work on helps determine 80% of the overall impact, meaning the initial design decisions that you make are incredibly influential as the direction the project goes from there. Let's look at the map down below. Unfortunately, at the beginning of projects, you don't have that much available information, and so you need to gather as much available information as you have within the beginning of the project because you set that trajectory. These initial decisions set forth a course. The more information you have, the better that course will be. As the project goes forward then, the amount of impact of the direction on that is extreme. You really want to make sure that that work is directed well because the ability to make changes to that project diminishes over time. This is something, again, I share with students to show the importance of the initial phases of work that they've completed. The discovery and interpretation phases are, in fact, are essential. They weren't busy work. They're essential because they help direct the trajectory of where that goes. That design, in other words, the creative acts, are in fact exactly an extension of the previous phases of work. So we ask ourselves, like, well, what activities could we use to help develop these ideas? So the first thing I would say before we get into specific tactics is this. Make sure you're modeling this behavior that you're not interested in right or wrong. Imagine that somebody suggests an idea, they're brave enough to suggest an idea in this developmental stage, and they're told, no, that's stupid, that'll never work. That would probably be the last time they suggest doing something. Instead, if you can be enthusiastic about it and say, that's interesting, we should definitely write that down, we'll talk more about that. Promote, in fact, this idea of productive failures. These activities and analysis that you do, learning from something because it doesn't work. Instead of saying that will never work, try it out. See what doesn't work about that, and then that helps you move forward. So within this particular graphic, it shows different tactics that one could use to help develop these ideas, to help get the ball rolling. We'll see examples of all these as we go forward. I have to tell you, the most important part of this as you develop it is make sure that there is a record of this work. Things that are said, even if they're great ideas, may not seem like they're relevant right away. But if there's a record of this work and graphic evidence and sketches or boards, these are things that you can come back to over and over once your mind is sort of free of the clutter. A very common question, of course, is, well, how do I help teach creativity? There's a few mindsets that help, and then a few tactics that you can use to apply. But the mindsets and just the sort of general practices is what I want to talk about here in this particular slide. Even though you're an instructor, think of yourself as a coach and a facilitator. Your job is not to solve it. Although you have information about the topic that students maybe do not have due to your level of education and experience, it doesn't mean that you're the keeper of this knowledge. It doesn't mean that it has to come from you. All you can do as a facilitator is maybe say, I wonder what that's like over there. Maybe you should look at this. You're always able to reinforce the trajectory of the past work. I'm not sure what to do in this design and ideation phase. What should I do? I'm not very creative. This is an immediate way just to flip it and go back and say, well, what did you learn by doing? Even if you use this diagram and say, well, where we are now isn't isolated on its own. It's based on all these other things. So what did you learn by doing? And with that, you're able to tie it back to these other exercises. And with the artifacts that you've had from those other exercises, it actually shows that they're already on a creative path. You're not asking them to suddenly be creative, that they've already been creative. If you use open and constructive communication, it helps quite a bit. I always employ this sort of show, don't tell rule. When we're at this stage and a student will say, I was kind of thinking that I might want to, instead of say, well, show me what you mean. These could be either sketches, or these could be reports, or these could be images, any way to try to have a visual, or tactile, or any sort of evidence of what they're trying to do. It helps be more concise about design as an activity. If you have to show, then you have to commit to something. Let's just say that they get stuck. Find targeted exercises and activities to help them get unstuck. Because we've made artifacts all the way throughout here, because artifacts are made in this ideation phase, ask them to continue to produce it. If you're stuck, write. If you're stuck, draw. If you're stuck, do more research. But make something. And because they have the artifacts, then the artifacts become the maps that set up not only the direction of something that ties them to what's happened in the past, but also where they go in the future. I can't tell you how many times a student or student groups have tried to solve all the problems, and they rule the problems out right away. Oh, I see why this won't work. I see why this won't work. And they get stuck here. Instead of getting stuck by all the ways that it can't work, ask them to not see what's difficult. Ask them to see what's possible. The difficulty will come in the testing and the evaluation phase of it. But you've got to get things rolling and getting them unstuck creatively. The voice and choice, of course, allows there to be different student projects which are somewhat divergent from each other intentionally. The exercises that we are going to talk about now are things that can help all the groups. They don't have to be targeted just for one group or another group. Work on ways of teaching, even the metacognition of teaching them how to learn, so that they can apply it and learn to apply it to their own particular project. This diagram, I drew the rings as these sort of orbital modules. And each one of these is the end of a module, the end of a phase. And in here I have Bloom's taxonomy. So you can have, say, an exercise about understanding that happens at the beginning before the discovery phase. You can have another group exercise about applying, another one about analyzing and evaluating, and another one about like the final sort of recreation of it. Each one of these tactics in the middle can reverb, expand out, and it happens at the right moment so then they can embrace it and make changes as they go forward. When different trajectories occur and happen within a class, one of the main complaints I oftentimes hear from instructors in higher ed that are dealing with project-based learning is something along the lines of, I've got very distinct learning objectives and products that they have to produce. There's skills and knowledge that we need evidence for. And if I leave it too open-ended, who knows where they're going to be by the end of the semester when the project is done. Let me be clear about the idea of ideas and inquiry. if you have a particular purpose for what you want them to generate ideas about, this is not open-ended. This is not without any sort of tethering back to learning objectives. In fact, quite the opposite. Within that statement is the solution, okay? If in fact what you want is to be able to demonstrate that students can design genetic strains of crops to fit within a particular region, then what you've done here is you've created a problem. This problem exists within a project. If the project itself is food safety and security, if you've asked when the project started at the first phase as, well, why isn't food safe and what makes food secure? At this point, you've generated those ideas of discovery, you've interpreted those and narrowed those down. When you're at your ideation phase oftentimes demands specific problems. Courses can set up by problem-based learning in which the instructor chooses the problem. But what we're talking about is being able to have these problems, the specific problem themselves, defined as part of the trajectory of the project. You nurture these with each of the students so that when you're in these phases here, you can help define what those problems are. Selecting problems within a project allows you to keep that trajectory and allows you to have the deliverables that you need. So always consider in project-based is a framework. Within project-based, you can have problems. This is a lecture and lab group of 90 senior architecture students. In this, the module I was teaching was about large-scale concrete form-based structures. These have complicated forms and behavior. The module itself was about lectures and labs. The final thing was a lab report. This is a 2-week project. So we transition then from the teacher-centered learning of the lectures to the student-centered of the lab, and the lab report is more of a mutual thing. In this, I give very distinct instructions to them about trying to document this process. What did you learn? What's your process and models? How did you test those out? How did you make it? What did you find? Like, what did you make? And then when we get into later the model testing itself and bringing it back to the analytics. I'm bringing this up because this is an architectural structures class with very specific learning objectives to it for what needed to be shown. But within that, because you have various projects that have design qualities to them, not everybody had the same solution, and certainly not everybody had the same process. By documenting the process, how they made decisions, what they chose to make, how they made it, and what they learned from it, is a way of both having a project and problems. It takes a very explicit instructions, in fact, to do this, though, is that even if you set up a general problem with a diagram over here, you have to be clear to them about what the overall goals are, the teams, the activities, and then you have to list specific questions or specific activities that need to be answered. It's thorough, but this thoroughness, in fact, is the roadmap for them to get here. So you're teaching creativity sometimes by just saying, here's the step and or the problem for you to try to solve. We'll oftentimes come back to this particular slide itself about the project-based learning tactics. And on the CELT website, we have different pop-ups for each one of these tactics so you can learn more information about it. I'm coming back to this page for one particular reason before we get into the specific tactics that follow. Is just to say that creativity is something that, a person can learn. And creativity is a skill that can be nurtured, but so is teaching creativity. And it really sometimes falls upon an instructor, especially if you're doing a project-based learning, and maybe if project-based learning is relatively new to you, to actually seek out different tactics and to learn different tactics and how those tactics, in fact, could be applied. And with this, all of these are usually about some manner of active learning themselves. And sometimes they'll be very specific things that, will really help you in certain scenarios. You definitely don't need to do all of them, but you'll find so many of these are related. Inductive learning to just-in-time teaching to case study methods, which we'll see here in just a little bit. Systems thinking and visualized systems thinking is an interesting tactic in which you ask them to take a particular topic that's easy to understand, in this case, how to make a piece of toast. But by visualizing and by drawing this process, it actually reveals things that maybe become more profound in reflection. This is a very common tactic to first get people to say, of course I can ideate and of course I can draw. This is a 2-minute process and everybody can draw and everybody generates ideas. So you get over this thing that like, I can't understand big complex problems. This is too hard for me. There's no way I'll be able to be creative. I'm not a creative person. And in just a couple minutes, just with this one thing, you're able to point out broader sort of systems and that in fact you've made an artifact. And this artifact is able to show not only a process of thinking, but a process of ideation. So sometimes I'll actually take them through this process, especially if we're doing difficult problems or wicked problems. And I'll say, yeah, systems thinking and visualizing systems thinking is in fact difficult, complex, but worthwhile. This is World Economic Forum Strategic Intelligence Map. And this is this great online resource in which you can take general topics, and these general topics, in this case it's now moved on to water, and it shows sort of the main hubs of different topics that intersect here, in that case energy and water, and how that connects all the way across to these other broader issues of water as it comes through. And when students are sitting there thinking like, I'm not sure what I want to do, or how does this relate to that, instead of asking them that they have to solve it all creatively through their own mind, through their own memory, instead look for these as research tools. These research tools point them in different directions, and so they can see how one is in fact connected to another. We just went from human rights to 3D printing for construction in just a matter of seconds. That way of being able to connect their field to other fields is really important. For the remainder of the tactics I'm going to show from here, I wanted to talk about this idea of how we give formative feedback. And formative feedback, of course, is feedback that's given regularly. Some operating sort of principles over here for you. Inertia is a killer. You have to make sure that you're active, even if you're separated and doing online teaching. Make sure that activity and that design and learning by doing is essential. Ask, what are you making? Have this be a rule. Each time you talk to a particular group, say, what are you making? What are you working on? In that, it shows you that your expectation is that there is activity and not just, well, I'm thinking about. Check back always with the thematic center of the work. How is this related to your previous work? If you want to make sure that students don't feel lost or adrift, make sure that they see that what they've done is an extension of work that they've already done, and that there's value to the discovery work and the research work and the empathy work, that their interpretation of the work is important, and that all of it, in fact, is the navigational tool to help them know where they're going. Because it helps them build off their findings. If they're sitting there saying, I don't really have a good idea to solve this particular problem, go back to what was found before. What doesn't work? Or what's missing from what you found? Well, I guess I found that there really was no solution for local distribution of food. But I mean, I don't know. I don't know if that's a good design idea or not. Of course it is. When you ask them to tie it back to what has happened before and what they learned before, what they actually find is that discovery and research and empathy is a creative act. And that this phase, it's not the first time they've been asked to be creative. It builds confidence. Contextualize them. Ask them what they're doing. What is this that you're actually going to make? Is it new? Is it improved? Is it some modification? Is it a plan, a proposal, or product? They may not necessarily know, and that's okay if they don't know, but asking them to think about it helps, because then they'll know what they should make, how they should test it as they go forward. And before you leave someone's conversation during this, always ask, what's next? You start it by saying, what are you working on? What are you making? And you end it with, what's next? Always come back to learning is doing. Learning is doing what's next. And by what's next, you still then tether the future to the past. A lot of times creative work is done in teams. And when teams are stuck, a tactic that usually works incredibly well, I think, is this idea of cooperative learning in what's called a Socratic Seminar. So if you have groups of people, and it's important that you understand that sometimes groups of people speaking up about design ideas is incredibly uncomfortable. It takes a lot of bravery to put oneself out there, particularly about a speculative topic. So used to and conditioned to have right or wrong answers. They know that they're being assessed for the work that they do. And so putting something out there that may be incorrect or may be on the wrong track is against a lot of what their normal behavior, sometimes seems like in education. So we got to make sure and uncondition this with actual activities that are made to make them think like sharing is essential. Learning is doing and sharing is essential. So a Socratic seminar could be gather a group of people together, develop a guiding question or subhead theme or proposal, something related to the larger work that you're doing. In this case, the Industrial Revolution's model for food production and distribution isn't sustainable. And then ask questions. Assign roles to them. Ask them to brainstorm about it or share solutions to this topic. I love the role-playing idea to this because let's say that you ask this particular question, you assign the person in the blue shirt, say, okay, your role here is actually that you work on genetically modified foods. You in the red shirt, you are a local farmer. You ask them then to share ideas about this topic based on their role playing. Then as a group, you get them into the Socratic Method, is that they ask questions of each other. So the person who's doing that role playing work, other people ask questions. Well, why is that? Why is that? What can you learn from that? So this Socratic Method is in fact meant to really examine an idea closely. And all I'll say to you is that when you're doing this Socratic Method, please, please, please make sure it's recorded somehow, that these ideas are recorded. Put it up on a wall, draw it, make artifacts of it, because then after even just a 15 or 20-minute Socratic seminar, what you're going to find out as a group is that they generate a great deal of very viable design ideas. And that design can then be seen as a cooperative act and a collaborative act instead of something that happens with sort of inspired soul act of genius. It models a really important, larger lesson about design and creativity. This one is also one of my favorites if the group itself is stuck. It's another type of class brainstorming activity. In this one, it puts you as the instructor in an interesting position to be able to do both just-in-time teaching and to model a heuristic method here. So here's how this would work. Concoct then a range of problems for investigation relevant to the class. Write them up on a board. General things, just you're basically asking them for questions. And then at that point, ask the students to select one for you to address right there on the spot. In doing so, then, you have to think aloud. You generate sort of broader ideas for the scope or the inquiry. Again, if we go back to the industrialized food production, they ask a question about that. You might then have to say, well, if it was me, I guess I would first look at the overall research of the amount of famine in the world now compared to 10 years ago and whether famine is a good evidence of, progress. From there, you've set the pathway, right? You might go, but I guess I need some help here. What sort of data will we look at for this? And then suddenly a student can chime in, or you can assign a student to chime in about that. Maybe you have another prompt. Assign that to another student. In doing so, on the spot, you're able to show that it's not scary to generate ideas. That all this is, in fact, is a way of trying to apply some of this knowledge, that there's not one answer to this. You demonstrate then how ideas can be tested and evaluated right there. You can help them as a group identify key considerations for evaluation. They start with a series of problems. You help show them how to generate directions for where to go forward. And before you're done with this, you have an artifact that's either on the board or in an online forum, and you ask each other, okay, what's next? Between the Socratic Seminar and this just-in-time sort of class brainstorming activity, what you can find is very quickly consensus can build around the next sort of first steps for this design and ideation phase, because they've all already been tied back to the research and interpretation that's already occurred. This is also one which I think is incredibly effective, which is an inductive learning case study method. Before we talk about the tactic itself, I would say I think it's always important in a project-based learning course that you have done research before you get to that class about different examples or case studies that are relevant to that particular topic. Find the right time to reveal these case studies. Oftentimes then students are going to find lots more case studies and you invite them to have other case studies. But you can show them how this as a tactic of using case studies can be used as a design generative activity. As example, class, what's the floating boom? Oh, it's that giant thing that's meant to collect all the plastic in the ocean. Yeah, it's supposed to be really great. It's going to work awesome. Well, so what are the qualities of it? How does it work? Yeah, I don't know. Well, maybe we should find out. So what did you find out about it? Now you're starting them then with both the inductive learning and then the case study aspects of it. You're pointing them towards the idea that investigating how something works or the effectiveness of it as a solution is an important part of the learning process. And what they find out is maybe the floating boom actually didn't work. And it's in a sort of fourth or fifth stage of development right now, and that some parts of it did work fantastic, but then other things still need improvement. Is now they've identified that research and design and case study and even inductive learning are also part of a creative act, because finding opportunities and why a floating boom did and or didn't work points to a direction about where the design could go, which ideas are sort of valid. And that instead of just saying, well, a floating boom's already been developed, I guess I've got to come up with another larger holistic idea. It's not that way at all. That the case study of the floating boom reveals that there's a very specific set of improvements that could be made on it, and that those improvements, in fact, are ample resources for design and ideation. The case study method is, of course, related to the guided discovery method here as well. I'm going to tell you a story about an instructor, a nutritionist instructor at WPI, Worcester Polytechnic, in one of the great problems seminars, this fantastic program that they have at WPI. In this, students were asked to look at food and food production. Student researchers told the instructor that solar ovens were supposed to be the right solution to sustainable food issues. According to their research, they were lightweight, affordable, they used less energy, etc. And they asked the instructor, why weren't they being used? I want you to imagine what happens if you were asked that question. Generally, in a typical project, when students ask a question about the content of the course, we feel compelled to answer. How do I solve this problem? But I think tactfully, instead of saying, here, I'll provide an answer, the instructor approached this like he would any other problem to solve. And he said, well, I think we should question the validity of the research. In other words, if no one's using them, are you sure this is the right solution to sustainable food issues? So he asked the students then to validate this research. He suggested, in fact, that they validate it not just by hands-off or something that just they found online, but he asked that they buy one and try it out. In doing so, the students found out that the solar oven that they picked was heavy, cooking took a long time, and it needed constant monitoring. In other words, it wasn't actually very effective as they thought. So in this case, the teacher had experience that led him to believe that solar ovens, there was something about it that they needed to try to understand from a first-hand experience, this guided discovery through the project itself. He doesn't provide the answer, but instead coaches and facilitates them to find the answer themselves. It's something I sometimes do in my courses in the role-playing and experiential activities. This particular group of students was interested in disaster relief tents and how they could make improvements to the tents. And so we asked questions, general research questions. Of course, the first phase is about what type of tents are they given to and by whom. Then at the ideation phase, we asked them to consider what's it like in the tent. And they found out by doing role-playing and experiential activities that the floor is rough and cold and insecure. So then their design idea came directly from that experiential activity. And they proposed that there be an elevated floor within these tents. So I asked them to imagine then, well, what you're proposing. How would you know if this thing worked? What are you making and why? They decided that they would actually try to make this. And so this, of course, doesn't apply to every single course and that you're actually physically making a proposal, but for an architectural design build course, it did. I mostly wanted to show you a mode of testing. The first things they made were tiny little prototypes, even just to see if they could do fiberglass and how strong fiberglass would be and whether fiberglass would even be viable. They've moved up to bigger and bigger prototypes, eventually made one. When they get done, the way that they tested their idea was actually to make and assemble an entire thing all on their own. And so they showed that their idea was valid. What did they learn from it? They learned about the handles, how the handles interlocked, the depth of it, the difficulty of actually putting a lid on this, and overall that it was still incredibly heavy no matter all the work that they did. So the role playing and experiential activities, you can link what you make and why you make to, again, the role playing and experience. How do we translate these tactics into online teaching environment? Well, I think the important part to realize is that the teaching is still an effective way of communicating, but the way we've communicated now is certainly different and modified. Instead of being in the room in which we can see and look and observe and have much more sort of easy group discussions, hanging things up on a wall, it now goes through a filter, and this filter is a screen. And in that screen and the filter, and the students are even isolated from each other, that filter, the screen itself now, is our catch-all for all of our inquiries. So WebEx, Teams, Zoom, all these things, everything has to go through this filter. Make sure in that filter that filter allows us to do things like annotate our chats, give feedback, post images. We have to be able to have some sort of evidence in there, because if it's like a TV show or a commercial and we just watch it and it's gone, then we've missed a key component of both feedback and formative learning, which is the evidence and the artifacts of those actual class activities. The edu-tech sector actually has some brilliant software for this design and creative brainstorming activities. A couple that I've used is Concept Board and Miro. Concept Board is a very quick, easy, again, open source thing in which you can have different ideas. You can post pictures of it. You can comments and links and everything like that. It's a very fast way that you invite the whole class to sort of share evidence. Miro is even sort of a larger open source forum. One thing I really like about Miro is, depending on the task that you have at hand, they have templates for these boards that are set up. And these templates either can be ways of decision-making processes, right? Or even like a 5 why process, or it's this guided chat process in which you can sort of navigate, and students can navigate their way through a series of complex things. You can tie different thoughts together with words. You can add videos, links, movies. All of it's really great. I'm going to show you very quickly then how I've been using this for a design studio project. Miro is itself a wide open sort of format. Think of it as a giant room with a whole bunch of infinite number of walls in which you can post ideas. We use it as ways not only for illustrating workflow and design decision making. We're able to put our actual assignments on there. We're able to show them how a design process would work. We have different tabs and sticky notes, and they're able to sort of make a note about what's happening in that particular thing. We show them decision-making processes. We give them examples where they can post examples, post questions, stories, links. We add research and reading in here. It's a visual way of telling this story. We do different class themes down here. These class themes then are filled with the evidence of what was talked about every single class period. Here's the key part. In doing that, you have the feedback that you give up here to where they're actually doing the work themselves. Finally, over to where their final sort of artifacts are produced. All of this is a way of then linking visually an open-ended resource to where you start, where you're going, and the work that they produce. It's been incredibly useful. Oftentimes people get uncomfortable being, as an instructor, what they perceive as the source for creative feedback. And I think this is part of the general tradition that the instructor is somehow the keeper of knowledge, and that there's this conveyance of knowledge from an instructor to students. It's the way progress is made. In project-based learning, this is a difficult thing to get over. Certainly you're being asked questions. What should I do next? What do you think of this idea? But try to move away from the idea that you're the source of creative feedback. Of course, give this feedback. Involve others in this work. Have guest reviewers who come in. Have professionals that come in. Ask them to do additional readings. Find other online resources. Have a way of them trying to contextualize their decision-making process of decision, not just about whether or not you are pleased, or whether you told them this is an okay thing to do or not. Of course, this idea of not wanting to do something alone is very common, especially when you teach, because you don't want to give somebody what you think is, say, a wrong idea or put them in the wrong direction. So again, spread this out. Ask for even for peer input. By tying it back to the previous work that you've done, this certainly lessens the idea that somehow one decision or one comment is going to affect everything in a negative way. What if my suggestions are bad? Yeah, I mean, look, this is obviously something that a person is concerned about, but try not to think of it as an instructor gives the trajectory to the project. The trajectory to the project is created by the students. They do the work based on the discovery and interpretation and even the ideation. This is not on an island on its own. This is something that's tied back to everything else, and that's the reason we tie it back to those. There's another side to this idea of being uncomfortable being the source for feedback, and I think it's important because it can also be somewhat of a nefarious aspect of project-based learning, and it's related to inclusive classrooms. Good teaching is inclusive teaching, full stop. At the same time, one has to be aware of the sort of perspective of race, gender, educational opportunities, or other privileges that are different from many students that might in fact do, change the way that one gives input. Thinking about how you live or things that you've lived through and these experiences oftentimes then help determine the feedback that you give about you should do this or you should try that or these tools you could use. So many times as instructors, we model behavior of how we were instructed. And at the same time, it's really important to check on whether or not that's still either relevant or necessary, but most importantly, making sure that all of this is inclusive in terms of its perspective. So always check. Always check yourself and check with where you've been. A tactic that you can do for this, use what's called a plus delta. On regular formative ways, get formative feedback from students throughout the semester. Maybe at the end of a module, you submit a one or two question thing. Was this particular tactic helpful? What did you get from that learning? You're asking them to reflect back on their learning and reflect back on how maybe you taught it. This gives a plus delta. And that way, with this plus delta, you can find out that yes, it looks like that was useful, or no, that wasn't useful. Then you're able to evaluate how that works with some of these tactics as well. Finally, I'll say this. Sometimes if you don't want to be the sole source of information with a project-based learning thing, you'd want to go back and how you set up the entire project has to change. And this goes back to project-based learning within a curricula. You can look at the idea of a traditional setup in which you have an expert or an instructor and students, and you're all around a certain disciplinary topic. This whole thing can be run with project-based learning. If you want more feedback, maybe you have a co-teacher. Maybe you're from different disciplines. Maybe that makes the project itself transdisciplinary. It might even help if all the students are from different disciplines. But the second form here, is a different type of class than the top. The tactics will have to be different. The topics will be different. If you want additional feedback, maybe it's co-taught and there's a community entity. Maybe the community entity is something in a service learning format that you're actually working on a project with a community, either direct or indirect engagement or advocacy, some way in which the community is involved in helping give that particular feedback. We'll talk about this longer in a different lecture, but just to make sure that as you're talking about the feedback that you give and the source of, trying to evaluate the feedback from this design and ideation, make sure that you first run it through this idea of how it's situated within the overall, group of who's involved and why are they involved. About design and ideation, just make sure you understand that, of course, this is a process that takes time and experience, both as an instructor and as students. Nurture that experience and trust that creative process and keep working towards this as a collaborative learning experience. Writing and recording and keeping track of what you do and just simply being mindful of how all those come about will really help you cultivate not only a project-based learning process, but the idea of having an inquiry-based educational approach be both beneficial, enjoyable, and, largely something that you would want to repeat and encourage others to do. Good luck.